Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Fuad Akhundov, and today I have the honor and pleasure to address you through ALOV channel. Well, to start with, I'm a researcher of history and architecture of Baku, but today's conversation is going to be dedicated to a problem that within recent 2 weeks is shattering the whole region of South Caucasus, which is renewal of hostilities around Nagorno-Karabakh that triggered actually the war between Azerbaijan and Armenia. And the conflict had been in place since 1988. It resulted with occupation of about 20% of Azerbaijani territories by the military forces of neighboring Armenia. About 1 million refugees and IDPs were expelled from both the disputed area of Nagorno-Karabakh and Armenia proper. So a country with the then 7 million population in 1993 had about 1 million of refugees and IDPs who still remain in that deplorable status to this very day. While the United Nations Security Council has passed 4 resolutions number 822, 853, 874, and 884, claiming unconditional withdrawal of occupying Armenian forces from the internationally recognized borders of the Republic of Azerbaijan. They still remain unexecuted and ignored. The Minsk group of OSCE that had been trying to find the roadmap for the solution of the conflict had been completely stalemated and had done nothing so far because of steady reluctance of Armenia to come from words to deeds. And in recent time, we had serious provocations on the border between Azerbaijan and Armenia, far away from the disputed area of Nagorno-Karabakh in the district of Tavuz, which is closer to Armenian and Georgian border. But that's a place where the Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan pipeline is running from the Caspian Sea to the Mediterranean, and the gas pipe is linking Caspian Sea to Adriatics, and the railroad is running through Azerbaijan and Georgia all the way to Turkey. So it's a very important kind of cluster of transportation and energy infrastructure that the Armenian forces were trying and still are trying to attack. So altogether, it revolved into a full-scale war that we have today, with pretty tragic outcome as in any war. Yet today I would like to try to identify the conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia over Nagorno-Karabakh, not from the standpoint of Azerbaijan or Armenia, or oftentimes the Armenian side tries to present this conflict not only as the ethnic one, but also as a kind of religious one, which is an absolute nonsense. While the conflict between the Azerbaijani-Armenian Nagorno-Karabakh conflict in its essence is a conflict of 2 principles, which are, to put it in a simple way, right is might or might is right. So there is a principle of prevalence of international law which respects inviolability of internationally recognized borders, territorial integrity of any country, while zero tolerance to any cases of intervention. So that's what the Helsinki Accords are saying since 1975. And in the meantime, the observation of rights of ethnic minorities and human rights and so on and so forth. That's exactly what Azerbaijan is standing for. There is a principle of brutal military force. When benefiting from the political turmoil in Azerbaijan in early 1990s, the Armenian forces occupied not only the disputed area of Nagorno-Karabakh, but also 7 Azerbaijani districts adjacent to it, turning them into a sort of dead zone. And that's exactly the combat field today. That's what Azerbaijan is trying to release, and that's what the 4 resolutions of the UN Security Council are claiming to unconditionally kind of retreat and liberate. Well, today we have to do it with force. When the law is not working, you have to resort to the force to enforce the law. So that's the mission of Azerbaijan today. And what is very important to understand, Azerbaijan is not fighting this war with Armenia. Not a single Azerbaijani soldier ever stepped into the territory of Armenia, even despite the fact that the 2nd largest city of Ganja and the big industrial hubs like Mingechevir and parts of this energy infrastructure are being heavily shelled by missiles launched from Armenia, we are not attacking Armenia per se. We're waging the war in the territory that international community recognized as part of Azerbaijan. And that's a very important issue to understand today. Well, the Armenian side often speaks about so-called historic rights for the lands of Karabakh, which is an argument that doesn't stand to any criticism. It's, any country today can recall the period in its history when it was much greater than it is now. Remember Austria and Hungary before World War I. Remember the Greek colonies in Crimea. Remember the size of Ottoman Empire or even Russian Empire. That's history. You can't recall the history, can't resort to the history trying to change the borders today. Any references to history as a backup for territorial claims are absolutely counterproductive. And by the same token, well, I can show you how Yerevan looked like. That was the fort of Yerevan the moment it was overtaken by the Russian troops of General Paskevich in October 1827. In those days, we didn't have photographs. So a battlist, Franz Roubaud, portrayed the fortress of Yerevan, which in 1827 had more minarets than the fortress of Baku in 1860. So there were more mosques and minarets in Yerevan in 1827 than in Baku in 1860, which shows that Yerevan was mainly populated by Azerbaijanis. Where are they now? Expelled, uprooted. Where are the minarets and the mosques? The only one that survived is steadily called by Armenians the Persian mosque, which is nonsense, because there is no concept of Persian mosque or Azeri mosque. Like in Christianity, you have Catholic cathedral, Orthodox church, Protestant church, and Islam you have Shia and Sunni congregations, and they have their mosques. So both Azerbaijanis, at least those living in Yerevan and the rest of Armenia, and Persians were Shias. So they try to kind of eradicate any trace of Azeri history in what used to be the historic residential areas of Azerbaijanis that afterwards, under the Soviets, became part of what now is Armenia. So we can also recall something in our history, yet we don't do it. We don't claim a piece from Armenia. We just want to be the owners in our own land. And the Armenian population of Karabakh was mainly resettled by the Russian administration in early 19th century, when as a result of two wars between Russia and Persia and two peace treaties, the Treaty of Gulistan of 1813 and the Treaty of Turkmenchai of 1828, all the areas up north from the Araxes River became part of Russia. This is now Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia. And the Russians were making border between ethnic Azeris, in our case, because you have about 10 million Azeris living in Azerbaijan, but you have estimated 25 to 30 million ethnic Azeris still living in Iran, and yet not a single, sound Azerbaijani politician would ever claim those lands to be annexed to Azerbaijan. But the Russians understood they're making a border between Azeris in the north and Azeris in the south. So their plan was to move as many possible Armenians as possible, as many Armenians as possible, to settle them along this newly created border, which would become the border between Russian Empire and Iran, and then Soviet Union and Iran, and today it's our border with Iran. But the river of Araxes for Azeris is like kind of Berlin Wall. It's a bisecting river, and the plans of Tsarist Russian administration was to settle Armenians along the border to make an Armenian buffer. Yet the Armenians claimed better lands, and many of them were located in the mountains of Karabakh, which is kind of paradisal place, sort of Switzerland. And that's how we existed throughout the Russian Empire, which had only provinces, not ethnic republics. Collapse of Russia resulted in the first independence of Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia. And in those days, we had severe wars between Armenians and Azeris, Armenians and Georgians, in some areas of Georgia with dominant Armenian population. That resulted in the takeover of the whole region by the Soviet troops in 1920 to 1921. And they made us part of Soviet Union But in the Soviet Union, they understood you can't annex to Armenia a piece of land that doesn't even have border with Armenia. So what they did, they kept Karabakh, which by its very origin, Qarabağ in Azeri means black garden, a very orchardous and flourishing place. So they kept it within Azerbaijan, but Stalin granted Armenians autonomy in Nagorno-Karabakh, and that was a time bomb. The same thing it did in South Ossetia and Abkhazia. It did lots of autonomies all over North Caucasus, and those autonomies were an excellent tool to trigger the ethnic conflicts whenever Moscow lost control over the area. So that's exactly what happened under Gorbachev in 1988, when the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh was ignited again. And well, it resulted in a huge war back then, but the political turmoil in Azerbaijan in early 1990s resulted in the annexation of lands, not only in Nagorno-Karabakh, but the areas of the valley of Karabakh. And those areas are the hotbeds and the cradles of Azerbaijani music, like Shusha, of Azerbaijani culture, vocal art, wineries. So it's a part of Azerbaijani identity that we're fighting for now. And not a single country in the world ever recognized the so-called Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh, or Artsakh, which is a kind of prehistoric name the Armenians are trying to introduce into political discourse, which sounds at least ridiculous to me. But even Armenia never granted any recognition to this self-proclaimed regime. So today, Azerbaijan is fighting on its own land. And we're fighting to execute the 4 resolutions of the Security Council claiming unconditional withdrawal of troops, and we're ready to welcome the Armenian citizens of the Republic of Azerbaijan in Nagorno-Karabakh, provided they respect the Azerbaijani sovereignty, like it happened for decades, and history shows a number of examples of excellent coexistence in between the two nations. So this hostilities of Armenians with both Azerbaijanis and Turks for what they call genocide, but in fact it was a huge tragedy for both Turks and Armenians. So identifying us with Turks, they kind of transformed their historic hatred on Turks upon us. But altogether, it puts Armenia into a very complex and very stagnant situation, because Armenia is quite a small country, and 86% of Armenians' borders are the borders with either Azerbaijan or Turkey. They only have a tiny border with Iran of 44 kilometers and less than 200 kilometers of border with Georgia. So these are the only operational borders of Armenia. How can a landlocked country with 86% of its borders locked down develop with no natural resources, no access to the sea? It's an absolutely suicidal policy, and this attitude towards both Azeris and Turks put Armenians into a greater quandary, because they could be a good transit area for oil pipelines that now are running from the Caspian Sea all the way to the Mediterranean, or the gas pipeline running from Azerbaijan all the way to Adriatics, or the railroad that could shorten the transportation from China to Europe to 12 days. All these communications and transportation lines could easily run through Armenia, and that would be much cheaper. Today, they go détour Armenia through Georgia, which leaves Armenia in catch-22 situation, when their hostility towards their immediate neighbors, historic neighbors, put them into an absolutely stagnant position, and very poor records with COVID-19, deplorable economic situation, huge immigration and exodus from Armenia, well, made the situation made the people quite unhappy. And in this situation, for some of the politicians, the war is the way to distract the attention of their population from horrible problems within the country to an outer enemy, which is obviously not the way to address the serious international issues. So I tried to give you in a nutshell the situation that we have today with Armenia. And once again, Azerbaijan doesn't have claim to a square centimeter of Armenian territory, but we need to restore our sovereignty within the borders that were internationally recognized as integral part of the Republic of Azerbaijan. And that's what we're trying to do, but sometimes to prove the law, you have to resort to force, to enforce the international law, and to make the resolutions of international organizations work sometimes requires force. This is not the very good option, and Azerbaijan was trying to avoid it for a good 27 years. But our patience is not infinite, and the failure of the Minsk group of OSCE to settle the issue and the lack of attention from the world community to the problem is what resulted in the renewal of hostilities today that are claiming thousands and thousands of human lives on both sides. That's the tragic situation as of now. And it was my honor and pleasure to talk to you. And I'm your humble servant, Fuad Akhundov, on ALOV channel.